Our mission is to help you, as we help ourselves, discover wisdom from all over the world, from any time in history, from any tradition, from any discipline: science, philosophy, literature, art, Africa, South America, China, even the United States occasionally. Welcome. It's good to have you here. Let's get to it. This is Passages, our summer series where we take a passage. It looks weird usually and completely inscrutable, and then we try to take our time and work through it and find out that maybe it does mean something after all, and we look for the paths to wisdom at the end. What can we learn from this text? What can we apply from this text, ancient or contemporary, in this time and place? So it's going to be a fun one tonight. I love this. This is Zhaungzi, an ancient Chinese text. Now, I'm about to make a statement. You actually may think this was me saying this. I promise you this was not me, especially on the postmodern lecture when you gave me such trouble. This is not me. This is an ancient Chinese philosopher. Now, I'm about to make a statement. I don't know whether it is in the same category as assertions that are so, or not in the same category as assertions that are so. Being in the same category and not being in the same category, well, they both belong to a single category type. Hence, the statement is actually no different from its contrary. Nevertheless, let me state it. That's my favorite line in the whole passage. Nevertheless, let me state it. There is that which has begun. There is that which has not yet begun to begin. There is that which has not yet begun to begin to begin. There is that which is, there is that which is not. There is that which has not yet begun to be that which is not. There is that which has not yet begun. I've lost my place. There is that which has not yet begun to begin to be that which is not. Suddenly, there is that which is not, but I don't yet know whether being that which is not is being or not being. Now I have said something. Have you really? Now I have said something, but I don't yet know whether what I have said has actually said anything or whether it has actually not said anything. Welcome to Taoism. That may be hard to read, but I want to give you a sense of where this text is coming from. And you will see the ancient dynasties of China, and you will see the Xia at the beginning, 2100, 1600, then the Shang, which is the oldest and actually influenced so much of Chinese culture, about 600 years, 1600 to 1050. And then look what comes next, and that is the Chu dynasty. And forgive my pronunciations, I do not know Chinese, either kind of Chinese. But look at that. That's about, what, 800 years of this dynasty. All right, so you see on the right column, you see the spring-autumn period, 770. Then Confucius, or Confucius, as we say, 551 to 479 BCE. And then the Warring States period, 475 to 221. And as you can see, that's the end of the Zhou dynasty right there. So this comes at a very troublesome time in Chinese history. I always hesitate to say that because it seems like every time a historian comments on the time, it's always a unique time of conflict. And I'm like, is there ever a period in history where it's like, no, there was no conflict and everything's pretty level? I guess that wouldn't make for good historian work. But sure enough, this is true. The Warring States period, 475 to 221. the Zhou dynasty has lost its authority. And again, that's 800 years of authority that's now dissipating. What happens during this time? We might know a little bit of what that's like. I don't know, here in 2018. What happens when the dominant and given traditions start to dissipate or unwind? Well, there's increasing violence. This is always the case in societies, is when a dominant myth, when a story begins to unravel, you're disoriented. The people are disoriented. There's no other way no other effect of that, because to have one story or to have one mythology is to orient you in the world and in relation to each other. When that goes away, you have to restart it. And you can't restart it without this period of destruction and dissolution and confusion, even chaos. So there's a lot of, it's the Warring States period. It's a pretty good description. And so this gives birth to what's called the 100 Schools in ancient Chinese philosophy. And it's the resurgence of Confucianism, the emergence of Mohism, and the resurgence of Taoism. I'll explain what I mean by that. But basically, we have these three schools, 100 schools. The Chinese typically use numbers to just mean a lot. So there was a lot going on. I don't think there were actually 100 schools. There were a lot of schools and various sects within the schools. So we've got the Ruists, or the Confucians, all right? So it's hard for us to understand these because there are no real analogs in Western culture. So the Confucians, or the Ruists, they were the traditionalists. They were conservatives, but I don't want to say that word and have you connect it to American conservatives. They were conservatives in the literal sense. They wanted to conserve the tradition that had been in place since the Zhaungzi, since the ancient dynasty. Confucius saw himself as continuing that and adapting it, and the Confucians wanted to keep that. They are the holders of the wisdom of the tradition, and they think to get through this difficult period, China must return to the past. Maybe that sounds familiar. That's an old myth. All right. Then there were the Mohists, who were the followers of Mozart, who, again, there's no real analog here, but obviously they're going to be in opposition to the Confucians, the Ruists. And so they don't like the tradition. They think the tradition is too elite, and it kind of was. And they want to inaugurate this revolution. Maybe that's too strong a word. They want to launch a new paradigm in Chinese culture. And this is relentlessly rational. All right? So they see the world in terms of duality, and you probably know that Chinese culture from the earliest time, from its indigenous religion, has been about dualities, but not in the sense that we understand dualities. It's more in the sense of a balance between poles, right? Between the yin and the yang, between the darkness and the light, right? And you just kind of balance. It's not laced with judgment as we do in the West, like good and bad, life and death, male or female. So the Mohists made much of this. They kind of took that indigenous sense of duality in Chinese culture and reified it and said, this is good and this is bad, and you must follow the good. You must follow the good no matter what, because, and this is weird too, to our sensibility, because ultimately they were what we call utilitarian. They were about pragmatics, but they thought that this kind of ethical presupposition about duality was the most pragmatic way to live. All right, so you've got these hard dualities for the Mohists, and they're going to prove which one is right by rigorous, relentless logic. Okay. And then you've got the Taoists. Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism, was a contemporary of Confucius, and we've talked about him before, now and then. An amazing figure who wrote a book called the Tao Te Ching, which is apparently untranslatable in English because it comes across in a dozen different ways in the various titles. It's the way and the way of being in the way, something like that. Tao means way, T-A-O, or sometimes you'll see it written with the phonetic D-A-O. The Tao is the way. And Lao Tzu says in the Tao Te Ching, I don't know who created it. It's older than God. So the way is a principle. It's not even a principle, it's a force. It's much like Brahman in the Hindu tradition when we saw in the Chandogya Upanishad. But it's different in that it's more obviously active in the world. You'll see what I mean as we go along. All right, so here's the context, and it's really important for understanding the passage. And you'll see why in just a minute. So this is the author, Zhaungzi, or you may see it written with the CH sometimes, Master Zhuang. And he is a disciple of Lao Tzu. So he represents the Taoist tradition during the Warring States period. So he's got a point here too. He does not align himself with the Confucians or the Ruists, although he adopts Confucius as a spokesman for his position. Genius, right? So he's very much a literary philosopher, something like Kierkegaard in the East. He's going to use parody and paradox and satire to get his point across. So Confucius actually appears quite a bit in his text, but to represent his own view, which Confucius himself would disagree with, right? Genius. So this is about a century after Confucius, and this is really interesting. This is from an article by Shijing Lin that I discovered, and I found this really interesting. So he's in, Zhuangzi is in the Chu state, in the Zhou dynasty, and there's this interesting quality of Chu culture, says the scholar. And I'm just going to read what he says. A common Chu motif was the vivid depiction of wildlife. And I love that piece there. I don't know if you can see it. It's the Tomb Guardian. It's in the Sackler Gallery in D.C. Vivid depiction of wildlife, mystical animals, and natural imagery such as snakes, dragons, phoenixes, and tigers, free-flowing clouds, and serpent-like beings. Some archaeologists speculate that Chu may have had cultural connections to the vanished Shang dynasty, the old one, right? The one that is kind of the foundation of Chinese culture. And again, remember, that's what Confucius was trying to do. He's trying to reconnect to that old original dynasty that worshipped a kind of, well, a deity called the Zhaungzi. Very syncretic, joining traditions freely and happily. A lot of shamans in this culture. So an interest in ritual and the experiences of the other. And then, yes, diversity, which I found very interesting. So again, from the scholar Lin here, the diversity of regions and cultures in early China has increasingly been acknowledged, and most interest has been directed to the state of Chu. In large part, again, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing, in large part because of the wealth of archaeological evidence that's being unearthed there. As one develops a sensitivity for this culture, the culture of Zhuangzi, one senses deep resonances with the aesthetic sensibility of the Taoists and with Zhuangzi's style in particular. The silks and bronzes of Chu, for example, are rich and vibrant. The patterns and images on fabrics and pottery are fanciful and naturalistic. However, this is archaeological evidence, so we can't be sure, but it is an interesting premise. Zhaungzi, the text, the Zhaungzi, as it appears in the literature, was actually originally 52 chapters, and then an editor named Kuo Shang, 312 of the Common Era, he came through and reduced it down to 33 chapters. So, if there's nothing else we should learn in our quest for wisdom, it's that these sacred texts are not written in stone. They're fluid. In fact, they began in fluidity and oral culture, and even when they get written down, they keep changing because we keep changing. And so, yes, the original Zhaungzi was 52 chapters, but the one we have is now 33. And in fact, it's probably the inner chapters only, chapters 1 through 7, that were by Zhaungzi, although now the latest scholarship is, of course, that Zhaungzi didn't even exist, really. I think he'd get a great kick out of that, as you'll see when you hear his voice more. The same thing happened with Jesus studies in the 19th and early 20th century. Suddenly, when you apply scholarship to the New Testament, it's like, oh, well, first of all, there's no New Testament at all. But there are fragments which are copies of copies of copies of whatever. And then it's like, we don't really have a lot of historical evidence for Jesus. There's probably enough to say that he exists, but as for what he said and what he did, that's very hard to come by historically. And then there are the outer chapters and the miscellaneous chapters. So what happened here is probably what happened with the New Testament itself, is that the followers wrote things. That actually makes a lot of sense. When the founder or the principal figure dies, the followers take up writing. And in the ancient world, our notion of copyright did not exist. And so you would just put your mentor, your guru, your leader's name on the text and say, he wrote this. This is exactly what happens with John in the New Testament. It's almost certain that John the Apostle did not write the book of Revelation that is attributed to him, but his followers did. Pretty clear evidence of that. This happens, again, all the time in sacred texts, is that the followers take up the charge and create more of the sacred texts. It even happens in Islam. There's something called the Hadith, which is the sayings of the prophet written by his followers in their recollections and remembrances. All right, so let's get into it. This is the first chapter. I love the chapter titles. Free and Easy Wandering, right? Nice. There's the Chinese, which I'm not going to butcher for you. Can be sometimes translated going, rambling without a destination, or wandering beyond. Wandering beyond. So everything's a symbol, right? Everything's a metaphor. So it's not just about wandering around China. It's about wandering around your life and wandering around the things that have been thought and said and believed in the world. We're here all the time, but we're really wandering here at the university. Our minds are wandering. Our thoughts and hearts are wandering around all these traditions and all these ways of knowing and being. And that's why I sometimes say that this is a group for seekers. If you're a finder, not sure why you would be here, but you're welcome. There are plenty of places for finders. There are not so many places for seekers. All right, here is Zhaungzi. Therefore I say the perfect man has no self. The holy man has no merit. The sage has no fame. Yao wanted to cede the empire to Yu. When the sun and moon have already come out, he said, it's a waste of light to go on burning the torches, isn't it? So, said Su Yu, who wants to cede the kingdom. When the seasonal rains are falling, it's a waste of water to go on irrigating the fields. If you took the throne, the world would be well ordered. Please take my throne. I go on occupying it, but all I can see are my failings. I beg to turn over the world to you. Zhaungzi said, you govern the world, and the world is already well governed. No, thank you. I don't want your kingdom because you're doing fine, because it's not about you, it's about the Tao. Now, if I take your place, will I be doing it for a name? But name is only the guest of reality. Name is only the guest of reality. Some beautiful, poetic, and powerful phrases and images here. Will I be doing it so that I can play the part of a guest? When the tailor bird builds her nest in the deep wood, she uses no more than one branch. When the mole drinks at the river, he takes no more than a bellyful. Go home and forget you ever said this. No, thank you for your kingdom. There are a lot, the Zhaungzi, the text is much like the Bible in that sense, in that it's a series of parables and stories and sometimes philosophical dissertations on a subject. All right, so yes, there's I don't know if you know the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, but it's a fantastic resource. And let's see, there's an author there, Steve Coutinho, who wrote the entry on the Zhaungzi, and he did a fantastic job. So I wanted to let you hear his voice some. So there's a sense here in the Zhaungzi of nothing, of the nothing, and you're going to hear it as I keep reading passages. And he says this, the word is wu, and he says it's usually translated nothing or without. But he says, more importantly, these nothings are not to be understood as simple negations. They have a much more complex function. The significance of all these expressions must be traced back to the wu of Lao Tzu, a type of negation that does not simply negate, but places us in a new kind of relation to things, a phenomenological weighting that allows them to manifest these no things, one that acknowledges the space that is the possibility of their coming to presence, one that appreciates the emptiness that is the condition of the possibility of their capacity to function. That's negative capability, right? In English majors, anybody? To be useful, as the hollow inside of a house makes it useful for living. The behavior of one who wandering beyond, becomes wu-wei, sensitive and responsive without fixed preconceptions, without artifice, responding spontaneously in accordance with the unfolding of the interdeveloping factors of the environment, of which one is an inseparable part. So you'll not be surprised to learn that Taoism influenced Chan Buddhism or Zen Buddhism when it entered China. And so this notion of emptiness may be familiar to you. And in the West, we see it as, just nothing, but it's not nothing in the East. It's possibility, capability. It's not yet in existence, right? So it's not a simple negation, which I find fascinating. It's energy, yeah, before it becomes matter, say. Yeah, exactly. And so there's this horizontal sense of a continuum and things operating on this continuum, and you are among them. You are not outside of them. That's important. We're going to come back to that. And then there's this kind of vertical sense of the vast and the petty. And this is Zhuangzi on that. And in fact, the text starts out with this about how there's a giant bird that lives in the north, and that bird, and then there's a very small creature who lives somewhere else. And the point is, you don't know the world from the perspective of the giant bird or the small creature. You don't know the world. How shall we discount their knowledge? And so that leads to our relativity of knowledge. This is Zhaungzi. Little understanding cannot come up to great understanding. The short-lived cannot come up to the long-lived. How can we know this is so? The morning mushroom can understand nothing of the alternation of night and day. The summer cicada can understand nothing of the progress of the seasons. Such are the short-lived. South of Chu, one finds a lizard called the dim spirit. Some wonderful English translations here. There's a dude named Gaptooth who I want to party with sometime. There's a lizard called the dim spirit, which counts 500 years as one spring and 500 years as one autumn. In high antiquity, there grew a great rose that counted 8,000 years as one spring and 8,000 years as one autumn. Such are the long-lived. Yet today, there's a guy like a Methuselah-type character, Ping Zhu, who's the best-known exemplar of longevity, whom crowds of men wish to be equal. How pitiful. How pitiful to want to exist in the continuum of life of a creature that you are not. How pitiful. It's a recipe for failure. And again, the scholar here, Lin, says, now while it's true that the vast loses sight of the distinctions noticed by the petty, it does not follow that they are thereby equalized, as the editor of the text in 312 CE suggests. So some of the contemporary scholars are going against that editor, that old editor. For the vast still embraces the petty in virtue of its very vastness. The one still embraces the many, the one still embraces the empty. The petty, precisely in virtue of its smallness, is not able to reciprocate. That's why it's petty. It's not that it doesn't exist or it's bad, it's just too small. Discussion on smoothing things out. This is the core of the text. So if the first 7 chapters are the original and the most meaningful, then this chapter is the center, the core. So let's hear from Zhaungzi here. Great understanding is broad and unhurried. Little understanding is cramped and busy. Great words are clear and limpid. Little words are shrill and quarrelsome. In sleep, men's spirits go visiting. In waking hours, their bodies hustle. With everything they meet, they become entangled. Day after day, they use their minds in strife, sometimes grandiose, sometimes sly, sometimes petty. Their little fears are mean and trembly. Their great fears are stunned and overwhelming. They bound off like an arrow or a crossbow pellet, certain that they are the arbiters of right and wrong. They cling to their position as though they had sworn before the gods, sure that they are holding on to victory. They fade like fall and winter, such is the way they dwindle day by day. They drown in what they do. You cannot make them turn back. They grow dark as though sealed with seals. Such are the excesses of their old age. And when their minds draw near to death, nothing can restore them to light. Joy, anger, grief, delight, worry, regret, fickleness, inflexibility, modesty, willfulness, candor, insolence, all music from empty holes. Mushrooms springing up in the dampness, day and night replacing each other before us, and no one knows where they sprout from. Let it be. Let it be. It is enough that morning and evening we have them, and that they are the means by which we live. Without them, we would not exist. Without us, they would have nothing to take hold of. This comes close to the matter. But I do not know what makes them the way they are. It would seem as though they have some true master, and yet I find no trace of him. He can act, that is certain, yet I cannot see his form. He has identity, but no form. I love this. Once a man receives this fixed bodily form, he holds on to it waiting for the end, sometimes clashing with things, sometimes bending before them. He runs his course like a galloping steed, and nothing can stop him. Is he not pathetic? Sweating and laboring to the end of his days and never seeing his accomplishment, utterly exhausting himself and never knowing where to look for rest. Can you help pitying him? I'm not dead yet, says Monty Python. No, says, thank you. That was pretty obscure, but you got it. I'm not dead yet, he says, but what good is that? His body decays, his mind follows. Can you deny that this is a great sorrow? Man's life has always been a muddle like this. How could I be the only muddled one and other men not muddled? Even an idiot has a teacher, he says, because even an idiot has his or her own mind. Here's a fairly famous passage that may relate to the passage we're studying tonight, and it's in the same chapter. Everything has its that, and everything has its this. From the point of view of that, you cannot see it, but through understanding you can know it. So I say that comes out of this, and this depends on that, which is to say that this and that give birth to each other. But where there is birth, there must be death. Where there is death, there must be birth. Where there is acceptability, there must be unacceptability, etc. Therefore, the sage does not proceed in such a way, but illuminates all in the light of heaven. He too recognizes a this, but a this, which is also that, and a that, which is also this. His that has both a right and wrong in it. His this, too, has both a right and wrong in it. A state in which this and that no longer find their opposites is called the hinge of the Tao, the hinge of the way. When the hinge is fitted into the socket, it can respond endlessly. It's right then is a single endlessness, and it's wrong too is a single endlessness. So I say the best thing is to use clarity. And then here's one of the more famous stories from the Zhaungzi. But to wear out your brain trying to make things into one without realizing that they already are one, this is called 3 a.m. It's not what you think. What do I mean by 3 a.m? When the monkey trainer was handing out acorns, he said, you get 3 a.m. and 4 p.m. This made all the monkeys furious. Well then, he said, you get 4 a.m. and 3 p.m. The monkeys were all delighted. There was no change in the reality behind the words, and yet the monkeys responded with joy and anger. Let them, if they want to. So the sage harmonizes with both right and wrong and rests in heaven the equalizer. This is called walking two roads. Now, take a look at our passage, right? Now that you know what you know, now that you know that the old order is dissolving, the new order is arising, and the Mohists are about their opposites and holding to their opposites and using rigid rationality and logic to maintain those opposites so that you can find your way. Now you realize that this sacred text is satire. It's a satire of the Mohists. I'm about to make a statement. I don't know if it's in the same category as assertions that are so or not in the same category as assertions that are so. Being in the same category, not being in the same category, they both belong to a single text. This is exactly the way the Mohists talked, right? So Zhaungzi is like, oh, let me do this. He's the first postmodernist, right? In 300 BCE. He's genius. He's using language against them. He's using language to show that language won't get you there. Language won't get you there, and your dialectic rationality and your rigid duality will not get you there. Here, watch, I can do that too, he says. And then, now I have said something, but I don't yet know whether what I've said has actually said anything or whether it has actually not said anything. If you've ever taken a philosophy class, you might be in touch with this emotion, right? Where sometimes we don't get anywhere. All right, moving on. Next chapter, the principle of nurturing life. I just want to tell you a few stories here. Kuk Ting is a famous character in the Zhaungzi. He was cutting up an ox for his lord. At every touch of his, by the way, ox cutting is a lowly position. It's like nothing anybody wanted to do. Only the poor would do it. At every touch of his hand, every heave of his shoulder, every move of his feet, every thrust of his knee, zip, zoop, he slithered the knife along with a zing, and all was in perfect rhythm, as though he were performing the dance of the mulberry grove or keeping time to the music. "Ah, this is marvelous," said the Lord. Imagine skill reaching such heights." Kuktin laid down his knife and replied, "What I care about is the way, the Tao, which goes beyond skill. And when I first began cutting up oxen, all I could see was the ox itself. After 3 years, I no longer saw the whole ox. And now I meet it with my spirit, and I don't look at it with my eyes. Perception and understanding have come to a stop, and spirit moves where it wants. I go along with this spirit, this natural makeup. Strike in the big hollows, guide the knife through the big openings, and follow things as they are. I follow the way." There's a wonderful story of a cicada catcher. This guy who lives in the swamp, and all he does all day is catch cicadas and eat them. And that's all he does, I'm saying. And so if that's all he does, if that's all you were doing, you would figure out a way to be a really good cicada catcher. And this guy does. He's got a pole, and he's figured out how to make some grease, and he puts it on the end of the pole, and then the cicadas just land on the pole, and it's just like, genius. He's in the Tao. He's in the way. And then a wonderful, brilliant section called Fasting of the Mind. This is ancient stuff, right? 2,300 years old, 2,400 years old. Fasting of the mind. Oh, man, I want that. Make your will one. Don't listen with your ears. Listen with your mind. No, don't listen with your mind. Listen with your she. Listening stops with the ears. The mind stops with recognition. But she is empty and waits on all things. The Tao gathers in emptiness alone. Emptiness is the fasting of the mind. And there's, in the sense of Taoism, there is this sense of retreat from society. And that's a very tricky thing because we can't all be monastics. Or if we were all monastics, there wouldn't be monastics. Anyway, let's not get into that. There's a sense of not getting caught up in the stuff of the day, in the stuff of society. And now you know exactly what I'm talking about, how that stuff gets on you, and then it wraps you up, and then you're like, it's 2 a.m, and you're thinking about this thing that happened or the thing that's going to happen that you need to happen, and it's, right? You got to retreat from all that. Now, again, the Taoists are saying retreat from that in your mind and self. Obviously, you have to be in the world. You have to do things. But as Lao Tzu says in the Tao Te Ching, do your work and let it go. Do your work and let it go. You get attached to your work. You do your work and you keep attached to your work. Well, your work's going out in the world, and people are going to do various things with it. Some of you people who make movies may be in touch with this, right? And you don't get to choose anymore what your work is because now it's out there. You might as well step away from it. Let it live its own life. Fasting of the mind, retreat from the busyness and madness of society. The realm of human interactions. This is an interesting chapter. There's a wonderful little fable here of this character who hears about this evil king, and he tells, this is where Confucius comes in, and he goes to Confucius, who is not Confucius, but Zhaungzi's Confucius. He says, "Hey, Confucius, I'm going to go fix this. That guy, he's wrong, and I'm going to go take care of him." And the first words out of Confucius' mouth are, "Well, you're probably going to be executed then." And then the dialogue continues where he talks to the young man and says, the feelings you have are noble, but they will not produce the effect you want. You must reflect on. You must be a pragmatist. You must realize what will really happen and what won't happen and act in the way accordingly. Do not force things. Again, from the Tao Te Ching, the world is sacred. It doesn't need changing. The world is sacred. It doesn't need changing. That's a Taoist perspective. All right, I'm not going to get into all this because I want to hear what you have to say. The signs of the flourishing of potency. This is so wonderfully weird. It's a bunch of people who engage in dialogue and they just have these deformities. This is where gap tooth appears. And there's this one guy whose body just kind of becomes twisted during the dialogue. And he's like, oh, well, I guess this is what is going to happen to me. So I'm just going to roll with it because, you can't force it. And then there is the vast ancestral teacher, one of my favorite chapters, and I'm going to read this portion to you. The true woman. She who knows what it is that heaven does and knows what it is that woman does has reached the peak. Knowing what it is that heaven does, she lives with heaven. Knowing what it is that woman does, she uses the knowledge of what she knows to help out the knowledge of what she doesn't know, and lives out the years that heaven gave her without being cut off midway. This is the perfection of knowledge. However, there is a difficulty. Knowledge must wait for something before it can be applicable, and that which it waits for is never certain. How then can I know what I call heaven is not really woman, and what I call woman is not really heaven? There must first be a true woman before there can be true knowledge. What do I mean by a true woman? The true woman of ancient times did not rebel against want, did not grow proud in plenty, and did not plan her affairs. A woman like this could commit an error and not regret it, could meet with success and not make a show about it. A woman like this could climb the high places and not be frightened, could enter the water and not get wet, could enter the fire and not get burned. Her knowledge was able to climb all the way up to the way. The true woman of ancient times slept without dreaming and woke without care. She ate without savoring, and her breath came from deep inside. The true woman breathes with her heels. The mass of women breathe with their throats. Crushed and bound down, they gasp out their words as though they were retching. Deep in their passions and desires, they are shallow in the workings of heaven. The true woman of ancient times knew nothing of loving life, knew nothing of hating death. She emerged without delight. She went back in without a fuss. She came briskly, she went briskly, and that was all. She didn't forget where she began. She didn't try to find out where she would end. She received something and took pleasure in it. She forgot about it and handed it back again. This is what I call not using the mind to repel the way, not using woman to help out heaven. This is what I call the true woman. Isn't that beautiful? All right, I'm going to skip this because we've gone far enough. What are the meanings of the Zhaungzi? Oh, my goodness. Well, I don't know. The editor in the 3rd century CE seemed to think that it was about this kind of radical relativism, so that any perspective was as good as any other. Well, that's really a hard philosophical or rhetorical position to hold, because then you can't really argue for anything. And Zhaungzi has a position. He clearly has a position on things and does want to argue. It just doesn't argue using the Mohists' rationality or the Confucians, the Ruists' appeal to authority. So the later scholarship on the text connects it with Hellenistic skepticism. We should do a class on skepticism, stoicism, and cynicism in ancient Greece. Fun, interesting stuff. Yeah, I know. Thank you. And Charlie just demonstrated the common misunderstanding of skepticism, which is kind of a pessimism. The philosophical position is one where it's an epistemological position where you say, I'm not certain of my knowledge. And so I'm not going to act without certainty. And so I'm just going to chill. And that's the ancient Greek translation. And that's a kind of fallibilism. It's basically acknowledging that my knowledge, my cognition, my way of knowing the world is flawed. At its very best, it's incomplete. I can't know what the giant bird sees and knows. I can't know what the small creature sees and knows. You know what? I can't even know what you know, and ultimately I can't even know what I know. So it's fallibilism. So here's a nice passage from chapter 2 that gets at this kind of skepticism, what the meaning of the Zhaungzi is. Now let's say that you and I debate. If you prevail over me and I do not prevail over you, does that mean that what you say is so and what I say is not? If I prevail over you and you do not prevail over me, does that mean what I say is so and what you say is not? Or is it that one of us is right and one of us is wrong? Or are both of us right or both of us wrong? If you and I can't know, then others will become as muddled as we are. Whom shall we call to put this right? Shall we call upon one who agrees with you? If he agrees with you, how can he put it right? Shall we call upon one who agrees with me? This is actually an ancient description of Twitter, isn't it? Shall we call upon one who agrees with me? But if he agrees with me, how can he put it right? Shall we call upon one who differs from both of us? But if he differs from both of us, how can he be right? Shall we call upon one who agrees with both of us? No, that's not going to be right. Thus you and I and these others, we all cannot know. Shall we await yet another? Harmonize all these by the horizon of heaven. Relying on it to stretch forward is the way to live out your full lifespan. Forgetting the years, forgetting all judgments, stirring within the boundless. What do I mean by the horizon of heaven? It is to say, assert what is not true, affirm what is not so. Were what is true so different from what is false, there would be no arguments. Let me say that again. Were what is true so different from what is false, there would be no arguments. It's not really that different what we're arguing about. Where what is so different from what is not, there would be no arguments. The mutual dependence of shifting voices is the same as if they were not mutually dependent. Therefore, lodge all of this in the boundless. Get outside of all that. Some of you know the work of Byron Katie, or have heard of Byron Katie. What she's doing is Taoism. I don't think she hides that. I don't really know, but I don't know why she would. It's Taoism. So if you know her or if you don't, here's what she does. She calls this the work. You do a fill-in, a judge your neighbor worksheet. Okay, I'm in. Yeah, I can do that. So you judge your neighbor. And then, she says, ask the 4 questions. And so you might say, Paul doesn't listen to me, she says. I'm judging my friend Paul. Then she says, ask the 4 questions. Is it true? Can you absolutely know that it's true? How do you react? What happens when you believe it's true? What would you be if you didn't have this thought? Who would you be if you didn't have this thought? And then she says, find the turnaround. Paul doesn't listen to me when turns around becomes, I don't listen to myself. Is that true or truer than Paul doesn't listen to me? Right? Another turnaround is I don't listen to Paul. All right. Ways to wisdom. This is great. You don't know anything. Nobody does. And because of that, there's nothing for you to say. Because you don't know anything, there's nothing for you to do. Because you don't know anything, you can let go of all your attachments and illusions. This way is older than God. As Zhaungzi put it, the fish trap exists because of the fish. Once you've gotten the fish, you can forget the trap. The rabbit snare exists because of the rabbit. Once you've gotten the rabbit, you can forget the snare. Words exist because of meaning. Once you've gotten the meaning, you can forget the words. Where can I find a man who has forgotten words so I can talk to him? Thank you for your attention.